Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth guide into the Talent DPS Calculator, a calculator that I've had for forever, and I've given it a slight update, as those that know it. Yeah, it's gotten a little bit larger, but we have more talents in there now, and I wanted to go over it, explain how it kind of works, use it as well to explain, for instance, how some of the talents have been changed, as some, of course, have been, as we'll go over how to also input into this and basically use that as well as a guide if you want to use this to calculate your builds with a talent, with certain talents, to use that for yourself. So yeah, let's go get started and first explain what this is and kind of how it kind of works. And those files can be found here in the DPS/damage calculator folder that I have. This will, of course, be linked down below together with the two files we'll be mostly discussing today. But there are other files in there, as for instance, yeah, if you are familiar with any of my build showcases, these should look familiar. These are the multi-calculators that I kind of use in there. These are made for calculating up to 10 different builds and getting their outputs side by side for comparison. Today, though, the file that we're mostly gonna talk about is the talent calculator. And the talent calculator is just that. You input a build in the same way as with the damage calculators. Basically, yellow fields are there to be, is where input can happen if it's necessary. So we input basically the weapon stats, the RPMs, the mag size, the reloads. We input the build's stats, which in this case, for instance, I've input an Obliterate Striker as kind of a basic build in here. There is as well, one will explain for entering in rate of fire that the build has, and this is important for if you want correct measured calculations. And when you input these, basically what happens here is that you get output up here. And as we'll zoom in a second, we'll explain and kind of go through it. But most of the popular talents that can kind of be quantified through DPS are in here, because some really can't. Although for some we still try, because I left out in the past, I would leave out quite a lot of talents out of here, just because, for instance, with Rifleman, yeah, it kind of depends on if you're getting those headshots in. Just outputting the 5 Rifleman stacks, or Rifleman at 5 stacks at all times, it's kind of useless. But then at this point, I've kind of gone like, okay, so we'll, instead of just showing that, we'll put it at 1 stack, 3 stacks, 5 stacks. For instance, for the Breadbasket as well at 1, 2, 3 stacks and such, and we get DPSs out of that. But then we kind of have to analyze that for ourselves. Same, for instance, with Frenzy, that requires a lot of setup, but can give exceptional results. Of course, we kind of know that, but yeah, we'll kind of go over the talents and also going to analyze them as well in this video. So if you're interested in that, this will all be timestamped. We'll first explain how this kind of works and how to input it, and then we'll go into analyzing the talents. So overall, what you will need to do, though, is that this is, of course, in my Google Drive, and you can't edit anything in my Google Drive. That's mine. Just hands off. But what you can do is, seeing as these are... you can access them, you can make a copy, and if you have your own Google Drive, which is required, but I feel most people will have one, you can make a copy, which is in this list. It will ask you to where you want to copy it to, and that file will go there, and that file in your Google Drive is then editable, because yeah, you do need access to edit it, of course, to input these numbers. Yeah, let's zoom in a little bit as we'll go a little bit closer. So up here, we have all of the outputs, and outputs come into 3 forms. It's the damage per mag, the burst DPS, and the sustain DPS, which is the 3 stats that we can quite easily get off of talents. Time to kills and such, I'm not going to per se do in here, because that's just too big of a mess. And personally, myself, I'm not too big of a fan of that anyway. Of note as well is all of these percentages next to them, they're all comparing to this top spot, and this top spot is no talent. Although technically this could also be, this is basically no damage talent. Because if you have, for instance, let's say preservation or something, or anything else that you might find useful on a weapon that doesn't increase the damage but is there, That would be signified by this. And of course, then we're comparing basically what the other talents add versus having a non-damage talent. So for instance, we see that the fast hands and the on empties are up here. They don't add anything to the damage per mag or to the burst DPS, but they of course add a lot to the sustain, especially on a FAMAS that is quite fast firing and has now a very long reload. But then on the other weapons, we can kind of see that generally what they have is that they will add the same amount over all three, especially if they're just a stat. For instance, in sync is just 40 weapon damage or 30 weapon damage for the normal one. The 30 weapon damage is just active and it increases basically all three by the same amount. Some other things that kind of maybe fill into RPMs and altering RPMs, like measures first and second half, we can see that there is a difference going in, for instance, with the damage per mag versus its burst, especially in the second half, the burst and the sustain are actually kind of affected by that. So it is kind of important to kind of look at that, of course. Again, to kind of shortly explain what burst and sustain DPS are mostly used for, we generally in Division kind of look at burst DPS first, as most of the fights that we have in Division aren't long enough for sustain DPS to really become the important factor. It is still an important factor. So what we generally want is good burst DPS, but then without, not to the dereliction of all the others, basically. So if it has a really good burst DPS, but it sucks in everything else, we might still not pick it. If it has good burst DPS, but its sustain isn't too bad, and its damage per mag isn't too bad, that's generally the top picks. Just generally how the top picks end up being anyway, inside of the Division anyway. And yeah, this goes down, of course, down the list, and we have some that are basically just amps, and we kind of see round numbers, exact round numbers coming out of them, but still kind of handy to know some of these, of course. Yeah, we get then to some, as I have here, where we have these reds next to them. You might have also seen some red DPS numbers up here. Here we're kind of averaging out a number over a DPS, where in reality, of course, if the firing time of a weapon with, let's say, strained is, for instance, let's say 2.5 seconds, we're averaging out that 2.5 seconds over a 1 second period. So this isn't technically the true DPS, but this is an average DPS. That's also why these say average with a yellow, and their bursts are redded out as, yeah, the relation isn't linear, of course, because strain, for instance, goes up and then kind of flattens out once you hit the 5 stacks in what amount it adds to a weapon. But that is then over a longer period than 1 second. So if we're doing a DPS, we kind of are averaging that out, but that doesn't mean that that is the DPS, because the DPS would be on the first second, it wouldn't actually be there, but it averages out on over the course of it, of course. So when we're averaging them out like this, it's not the best way of doing it. But that's also, for instance, why measured is split out here into both the first half and the second half, as still even the upgraded version is still better in the first half than it is in the second half, especially for burst. And then the second half is now actually pretty good for sustain and not too bad for burst. We'll talk about measured a little bit in the analysis part. And then, yeah, some of these as well have these red next to them with active. So killer, for instance, we have here. Killer, of course, is, we can't really quantify it in an averaging way, right? Killer is active or not active. It is a damage. So you're basically flipping between no talent at the top and killer with killer active. And you'll have to kind of guess or quantify for yourself how much one or the other will be active, right? I can't really do that for you because it's going to be different if you're solo, if it's going to be different if you're in a raid group, it's going to be different if you're fighting a hunter where it's going to activate maybe after you've killed them, right? But then it might be up a lot if you're doing activities and you're doing territory controls where there's a bunch of enemies that get killed and then the next wave spawns even in the timer that killer is active. So all of these at the end require you to have a bunch of game knowledge and to make an educated guess as to how active these will be. I can't in any way really give you any advice here outside of pay attention, maybe watch some of your footage, run the talent, and see what your actual uptime on it is. That is kind of how I look at it for myself. And then we have as well, for instance, things like Boomerang here, which is being both done in an average, but also in an active. So just averaging it out over an entire magazine, and basically making an actual DPS out of that, pulling a DPS out of the entire firing time, cutting that down to a second. And also just if it was always active, what would that be? So this is more for the active shots, and that's also important for these to the sides, which we'll discuss in a second, which are checking numbers. And then, yeah, we have some additions here as well that I, in the past, didn't have on this, such as Breadbasket, such as Rifleman, such as Frenzy, or Unhinged, or Finisher, because they were always, if you add them in, they look to be large numbers, but that can be misleading. You're not always on Rifleman 5 stacks, because at the very least, you need 5 headshots to get there. So at least the first 4 shots, at the very least, are not that. Then also, yeah, for instance, with a Rifleman, it is based off of headshots. What happens when you're fighting Razorback, which has no head, such and such. So these, again, require some knowledge on your end. Same for Ranger. You kind of need to know which Rangers you are fighting in commonly, because that is going to vary severely between players, between content. But then, yeah, to explain as well how this kind of works, just in case you also may want to in ways edit this to maybe add other talents for yourself or such. So we have the inputs, as we explained, in the yellow fields. There is, at the bottom here, a graphic that explains where all of the stats come from. So as it says at the top as well, there's instructions at the bottom. So go read them. There's a set of kind of rules, which we won't go one by one here, but they are basically to make sure that you have all of the stats correct. For instance, as well, DTOC not showing up on the stat sheet, but you just need to, know how much DTOC you actually have. Talents and such are, for instance, not showing on total weapon damage, for instance, does not show. You need to know from your talents how much you're getting from there. So that's require some knowledge up front. Also as well, if you want to have headshot numbers, you can basically either input the headshot or not input the headshot here. If you want the body shot numbers, you just do not input a headshot number. You can also even ratio it. So if you, for instance, the thing that you've seen me do on several of these comparison things is usually I set my headshot at 20% of the full number. And that is just that. You just take 20% of, for instance, on ARs, it would be 75. It would be 75 at 25% or 20%, which would be 15 actually, as we've used that a lot. So you can kind of factor those things in that. Same for DTA or DTOC. You can also factor them to a ratio just to get closer to maybe a better representation for yourself. Then also the thing is that if your build has rate of fire, as we'll explain this one, to get correct measured numbers, we need to actually know what this RPM, when we take it from in the game, you will always just input whatever the game shows. But then if there is RPM active, either also, for instance, for mods, for if you're using a GR9 and you're using a magazine with 5 rate of fire, you would need to input 5 here. And this is really only here for measure that does alter rate of fire and interacts with it. So for that one, you would need to have this field be inputted. So for instance, we have Striker, we input 15, and it needs to just be a full number. So it's, if it's 15 rate of fire on there, you don't need to like calculate it yourself to a 1.15 multiplier, which is actually, as you just input 15, and that thing gets used to do the measured calculation a little bit more correctly. It's not a big factor, but it does help a little bit, so I have added that in. And yeah, for those wondering how this actually works, it's nothing much behind the curtains, honestly, because everything is shown up front. As you notice here, you basically input it up here, and it just starts copying it to the fields below. Basically, all of these fields are tied together, so if we put it to 0 weapon damage, you may already notice that, for instance, for an in-sync, there's a 30 already here. Even to a 0, it's already acting as if it's 30. Same for some others that are weapon damage based, and that's literally it. It's basically a multi-calculator set up to take the numbers from here, take them to different talents, and these fields are filled in to the whatever the talent does, because of course all of the talents just alter stats. So we just alter those stats as well, and add crit damage where crit damage is apparent, you know, other things, and we get an output. And you can, of course, if you wanted to add a talent or such, you could do so pretty easily, either by editing one of the other ones, just making it match up to this one, and then adding whatever you wanted. Although I feel I've hit most weapon or most damage talents, of course, in here already. And one important thing as well, you can either calculate your weapon damage by inputting whatever it is shown in the game. So from the stat screen, as it shows here as well, you can go in here and you take this weapon damage number that is shown there, that goes up there. And then when you input your weapon damage combined from all weapon damage and specific weapon damage, that is as well, that is what that SVD is. That is all weapon damage plus the stat of that is active at the time. So for an assault rifle, it would be the assault rifle damage, for instance, in there. If you input those, it will back calculate a base. What you then have is that, it'll just populate with that. What you can do as well is from burst or sustain or DPS tables, basically the burst tables, go and take the base number from here. So for instance, with the FAMAS, and input that. That is also an option. So I've, for instance, here taken that option. And the reason for that is if you just want to do a build and you don't want to really fidget with it, you can just back calculate if you just want the results for a build. If you want to fidget with the numbers here, especially weapon damage, you need to input a base, which is the reason that that is there. Because if we were to alter this number, if we wanted to go like, okay, instead of width grading, if we take away grading, what happens? We would need it to come from this, because otherwise, yeah, it would fault out, because it is using that number to calculate this weapon damage, or you would have to, each time that you alter this number, input a weapon damage here, and that would mean owning all of those different types of weapons, which is not, of course, feasible in all ways. So yeah, if you want to fiddle around with it, I would recommend entering a base. But if you're just doing a build and you just want the outputs of that exact build, you can just back calculate with this as well. So yeah, that's kind of going over how this thing is and works. Although actually, one last thing is at the bottom, there are some bonus stats. So we do have the rounds per seconds here. We have the firing time, so the time to empty, the time per mag. The time per mag includes the reload, of course. We do also have, for instance, how many fast hand stacks are expected on a theoretical level as the average max, if all rounds were to hit, of course. We do also have a checking number here for how many strained rounds happen. This actually, for instance, in some ways you could break this if this goes to 0, just because of how I calculated it and didn't want to make it too complex. If this hits 0, this can break some things for strain. Although the thing it will underreport. But generally as well, the weapons that go high enough RPM to break strained in this way are also the weapons you wouldn't want to break strained anyway with. So it's not a big of an issue. And yeah, we have the 2 RPMs for measured here. Although of course nowadays I have split out measured into split numbers. So yeah, we have it up there anyway as well. Let's actually go into analyzing a little bit of these talents now on this striker, because there are actually some changes and some of them are kind of interesting. And of course, let's use this time as well right away to kind of analyze a little bit, because we have, of course, a few talents that got changes. For instance, measured. For instance, the status effect ones, ignited, ranger, killer, of course, a big one that got changed. Did Breadbasket get a change? I don't actually remember anymore. I was about to say Breadbasket, but I know it did, right? Optimist as well, of course, got a change. How do they stack up now? So if we're looking at it from a point of a striker, and this is also kind of the thing, it depends and that's why these exist, and there is no like whole answer to it. It depends on the build, because for instance, if we take a look at Optimist, just as a point, if we kind of look at it on this build, it is an average of 6.81 more burst DPS, but, or well, all of them. That is, of course, on a build that is at grade 27, which is the new max grade. If we were to put this at, let's say 30, you're all blue core. Well, actually, let's put it 40. You're all blue core. You have the watch. But yeah, you get specialization, you get the watch, and you get the weapon itself. 40 is kind of the minimum. If we now go back up, we see that Optimist went from what it was being below some of the other ones next door. It went up to being 12.5% now. And that's kind of the thing. A lot of these are, of course, a certain stat. The more of that stat that you have, the more diminishing returns you get into that. And that means that instead of, if we take this back to 157 now, yeah, it drops back down and we see it be affected in that way. Same, for instance, with Strained. Strained kind of likes having high crit chance, but lower crit damage. So on a build that is around like 6120, it works better than a build that is 6180. Measured, for instance, as well, has a like for not having any total weapon damage on the build anymore. We'll also kind of look into that. Let's actually start looking at some of these. So Fast Hands did get a kind of a pretty big nerf, a 25% basically nerf to it. Although, of course, with the way that reloads get calculated, we do have a logarithmic return on that as well. So that is actually super diminishing. And because of that, it isn't that big of, it is a loss, but it's not as big of a loss. The first few points in accuracy and stability in the same way, and in reload speed are the most effective. And then the more points you put into it, the less returns per point that you get. And that means that this, while it would take it to 1 second basically in the past, no longer does, but it is still one of the better sustained talents. And of course, the thing with Fast Hands is it's not so much just about sustained damage. It's much more about agency. Being not able to fire for 2.17 seconds means that you have much more time to be killed in that than this 1.14. Now, of course, this is the average max. You're hitting your entire mag, and on average, you're getting a 30 crits in that. Now, you'll be missing, of course, a few shots, so it kind of depends, but still, Fast Hands, having played around with it as well, it's still okay, it's still good, it still works fine enough, but it's no longer that big of an increase, especially when you look at it in LMGs, especially a little bit more. We have on empty here as well now, so the on empty is, of course, the annoying thing of it is it's not self-refreshing. So once you get it, unloading the next mag does not automatically refresh it. And that's kind of the downside of it. And as well, you have to, as the name implies, be on empty, reach the end of the magazine, which is something that I don't always do. I tend to just kill an enemy and hit reload. Now, this is more of a me problem than this talent's problem, but we can also kind of see that, yeah, it does help a bit. And of course, Fast Hands is just reload speed. On empty is weapon handling, so it's also improving your accuracy and stability. On empty is definitely a good pick, and especially in a certain way, as we'll look into in a second, because we're also going to look at, as we talked about, there's a perfect variant of this. As I tab over, it doesn't look like much jumped, but yeah, we now have a P in front of every and every talent, but also the increased reloads or the increased amounts of it. So, for instance, here with a burnout, for instance, as this weapon is actually a FAMAS that we're kind of comparing, it would take it to 1.21. With the non-perfect, it's taking it to 1.36. And it is, of course, very... You can definitely activate this. You will not always get max stacks in Fast Hands. Sometimes, actually, though, you will hit all your rounds, especially on a big enemy. If you have a heavy in front of you. And you might even go over 30, because, of course, it's based on critical hits, which is chance-wise. So sometimes you go a little bit even over this. If we look at InSync, InSync didn't get any changes, and InSync was always kind of, it is very reliant on how high your weapon damage is. It is very consistent, of course, if you are running for a skill with it to activate it, but the thing is that skill is sometimes inconsistent, of course. You would want to have a revive hive generally with a red build. Putting a turret, for instance, with it, or a drone, they get destroyed, they get jammered. If they're not active, you're back to being no talent, and that is kind of the reason we don't generally run InSync outside of actual turret drone builds. Mostly as well because the others just consistently can't perform to these degrees. Because yeah, we then have Strained and Optimist, which are often the general picks that we have now already for if you want to do a little bit more damage. Optimist got a little bit of a buff. It kind of also needed it. Grading really had eaten into it. And honestly, so for instance, not per se maybe on here, but if we had a little less weapon damage, maybe if we weren't graded to 27, I would definitely nowadays pick Optimist more over Strain. So if we actually, in the background, I'm going to go put it to 130 weapon damage there instead. They're getting a little bit closer to each other at that point. I would pick Optimist at this point. Optimist retains until you reload. Strained, of course, does not retain unless you're continuously firing. If you release the button for half of a second, which is really short. If you're even going between two enemies, if you release even enemies that are standing next to each other, if you kind of, are firing at one, you kind of stop firing just to start aiming for the other and then start shooting at them, you will lose straight. And that is a very common occurrence. And that means that Optimist on overall will kind of outperform him. Because keep in mind, we're averaging out in a theoretical way. This is perfect situations. In-game, you kind of have to use your game knowledge to kind of add to this. Then we have actually one of the things that got buffed, and actually looks pretty good now. We can no longer make fun of Measured. It is no longer the red-headed stepchild. It is in fact, a decent pick. The first half is still the good half. The second half is no longer as bad as it used to be. And that is actually what picks it up a little. Overall, especially on builds that don't have really high amounts of total weapon damage. So high-ends, for instance, would not want to pick this, but for an Obliterate Striker, which has 20, this is around that 10%. We actually take this back to 157 for a second as well. It is around that almost 11%. If we actually turn this, if we take the total weapon damage down to 0, we put 180 as the amp, for Striker, basically, making it a chest Striker. Yeah, for chest Strikers, I mean, exotics are very powerful right now, and you should be using them quite a bit. But outside of exotics, yeah, I would generally pick Measure now, actually. And this will, yeah, it's kind of surprising to say right after all these years of mistreating that, but it's definitely kind of back on the board now, and yeah, it needed a pretty hefty buff to do so. We're also splitting Measured into its first half and second half, so we can kind of check what is happening to it overall. And generally, yeah, the first half is going to be better than the second half. We have then actually starting with basically a bunch of these that are amps, flat amps. So Flatline would, of course, require a different build, even though it's showing here as a 15%. If you're using a build with this, you would, of course, be using it with an weapon that can generally take the Technician's laser, and then you lose a little bit of, because the more things like the FAMAS, the F2000, the CTAR that are a little bit higher up in the burst DPS tables, they can't take that. The Fall can, as one of the first higher burst ones. So you do always lose a little bit more than this 15. So this is also, for instance, one that you only really have to look at if you're really going to run Flatline, because yeah, this can be misleading because that comes at a cost. We'll see that as well in the AR comparison where we put on-built weapons. And yeah, continuing on with a Sadist, and of course, all of these other ones still, yeah, we're basically adding a flat amp. Sadist, Eyeless, Thunder, they're all become 30%. Ignited is still at 25%, which is a little odd. I feel Sadist maybe should have been the same 25%, but they are very powerful now, and especially for the builds that can really make use of them, like Ongoing. This has just been a buff to Ongoing, I feel, the Sadist especially. The upward movement of these has buffed Ongoing to be pretty strong. I've seen already some out there going like, it's stronger than Striker now. No, that's not true, but it is definitely a contender, and it even on its full pelt versus it at full pelt versus a Striker at full pelt is coming up to like 80% of it, which is definitely really good. Like that is way above a Glass Red, for instance, in the past, which is definitely a usable build, and also ODs can, of course, kind of do it from the first shot, or well, first skill, after the first skill. So that has definitely been a buff to it. But now as well, Sadist is so high that it might be worth considering, especially if you have an OD in the group, to run a Sadist weapon, especially maybe something with a somewhat larger mag. And even what you're losing in that extra, because some of the bigger mag weapons, let's say a GR9, don't really compare well to some of their brethren without that larger of a mag. Although the M249 is definitely looking pretty good, but the Infantry M25 is looking a little bit better. To keep it short though, Sadist is maybe worth running, but especially if you're kind of consistently keeping the uptime on it. And if there's OD, if you're not the OD and you have OD in your group, that basically means that it might be worth going with something like an LMG, which also all kind of look good now with Sadist. So you have 75 rounds instead of the, for instance, 25 rounds that a FAMAS would have. Because yeah, if you don't have the uptime on this, which you won't have, depending on what is happening, you might have multiple magazines where you might not even have the OD's buff up, depending on how good the OD is doing their job, and of course how much stuff is dying, because it's much more active if you're doing, let's say, territory controls than if you're fighting a raid boss, right? But yeah, these all look much better. Ranger as well, because Ranger at 20 meters is now basically a 10%, and 20 meters is not that far away. We get a decent buff out of it. And of course, especially with the modifiers now, it's stacking well with especially the long-range modifiers that are very powerful. There is actually definitely a case to be made for Ranger as a general use, more so than before. If we go now, yeah, we have the Behind You and also the new Precision Strike. They are here together at 20%. They basically, yeah, just add that in. Of course, these are very situational and again, require you to kind of give an estimate of how active you think they will be. Moving on to Killer. Killer, of course, got buffed quite heavily. It gives a lot more crit damage than it did. And because of that, it's basically a 20% when it's active. So this really relies on how active you think it's going to be for you. But generally, as the solo pick, I would definitely go Killer. If you're going for a damage talent, it is enough of an increase that if your build is set up to kill well and fast enough, with enough crit chance especially as well, then yeah, there is no substitute for this one anymore in solo play. The second you start competing for kills, this of course starts falling away a little bit. And of course, it is still an on-kill, so for some fights, you might still want to pick something else. Let's say the initial hunters in Countdown or such, because it's going to activate after you kill that hunter. But with the extraction, though, then yeah, then for instance, it's a really good talent. Close and Personal and Vindictive, and both of those we can kind of group up in that same, you need a kill for it to activate, but it's definitely, of course, handy to know how much they will be adding. Then we have a Boomerang here, and Boomerang we're doing at active and its average. We're averaging it out over a magazine, basically how much that would be, and then making a DPS out of that. Boomerang doesn't, of course, add much to the burst DPS. It is weapon damage. It's not a lot of it either, and because of that, you don't get too much out of it. But what you do get as well is increased magazine size. So we basically get, out of a 50-round magazine, which some of the rifles would have, it would go to a 65 round at 60 crit chance. And that does increase our sustain by quite a bit. So it isn't the worst talent, definitely. Although competing against the Ranger, for instance, with rifles, or competing against some of the others like Rifleman next door to it, I would generally pick those. Let's go to Breadbasket. Breadbasket can be kind of okay. It requires body shots and headshots, which is kind of awkward if you're trying to get the most out of it. You can get a lot out of it because a lot of people go like, Breadbasket is really good. In general play, I would disagree. Trying to hit body shots, following it up with a headshot over and over again, this kind of requires too much handling to get consistently this. Because keep in mind that your body shots are basically non-talented, so they're basically at the 100% mark, and then you get one shot, not a full magazine, like we're not getting a DPS out of it, but you're getting then one shot of that. So you could never really hit this. That's also why in the past I wouldn't per se put this as a burst DPS kind of output. But here, just to kind of illustrate that, yeah, if we at all times had that 3 stacks up, we would have this. But this is, of course, not reality. That's also why these are redded out. Rifleman can be a really good pick for rifles. It's, of course, only on rifles. If you just get some headshots in, you do get up to this number. And that is one of the bigger buffs that you can have. That's also why actually the perfect Rifleman on the SIG, which is one of the better rifle picks, definitely one of my picks. Frenzy always did frenzy things and still does. And yeah, it can really, this is of course on the mag that is active. Now this is a 50 round mag of a FAMAS, which couldn't have frenzy at all either. But if we were to, like, say, make this 100 rounds already, we see that it starts becoming larger. And then if we go to 150, we see again that it becomes, of course, larger as based on max size, of course. So if we go into the 200s of the GR9, yeah, we can see that adds quite a bit. Now, of course, how realistic is it to have frenzy consistently going? I would say not very, honestly. You can, of course, prep a GR or another LMG to have it ready for certain fights, and that's very viable. But yeah, this is just to know, basically. Of course, keep in mind as well, for the Riflemans and such, yeah, if you're inputting an AR, yeah, you can't put these on them. I'm assuming you know which talents do go on which weapons. This is not per se for the beginners, of course. So I'm assuming that you know that, yeah, the Rifleman is only really there if you have a rifle to get Rifleman with. Or these last ones, of course, Frenzy and Unhinged with LMGs. Here we see as well, like Unhinged, one of the reasons we generally don't pick Unhinged is this. It's not good enough of gain for the losses that you get in accuracy and stability. Even if we put this to 130, we don't get that much. So you would be basically having to be a blue cord. Let's say we put this on to 40, a blue cord heartbreaker or something, but then you wouldn't even be at 40. You would be at 65. Yes, 55. You'd be at 55. And yeah, you get 11% out of it. And that's at the losses that it comes with. And you could get 11% more so out of measured, or even more so, a lot more out of in sync up there. So yeah. Unhinged, never good, but just as a... And yeah, we have Finisher here as well. Now, of course, Finisher needs the pistol swap. It's still good. Always has been, always will be. But that pistol slot, there's a lot of competition for it. I generally don't have finishers on my pistols anymore. I now have mostly sledges. Sledge, of course, did get a reduction, but even 15% sledge is much more useful to me, I feel, than just a finisher. So yeah, we went kind of all through all of these. Let's go to a conclusion here, and we'll round it out. And to close it out, some final tips. As we were talking about earlier, you can actually factor your headshots. And for instance, what I've done here as well, my DTH or DTA to a certain number to kind of, for instance, here, basically DTH of 21 is kind of set to 60%, which is a number I kind of use. The headshot is also kind of set to a factor. So let's turn those back though to, actually, let's take headshot away. We'll just go with body shots. Let's put this to 21. So we have the actual numbers here. And yeah, one thing that I didn't explain kind of is these numbers on the right side. And these numbers on the right side are quite handy and important as they are checking numbers. So what you can do is to make sure that you've inputted the build correctly, is to come into here, and for instance, if you have no talent, if you are talentless, if you're, well, if your weapon has no talent, you can come in here and your weapon should hit these numbers. And of course, with the other ones, yeah, it should hit the other numbers. So yeah, if you have measured, for instance, you would hit the first, in the first half, you would hit, for instance, that number, and the second half, you would hit these numbers. That's very important to make sure that your input is correct, because if your input is missing something, yeah, that could affect, of course, how all of these kind of align. So make sure that you do check your numbers. But yeah, that is, as we went through the analysis and looking at this upgrade one, we didn't really look at the perfect one, but you can kind of look at that yourself. I'll link them, of course, both down below. Both are in this folder, they're next to each other. We'll kind of visit the perfect talents. I'm not going to separately do them here because they're of course tied to certain weapons. This is more just if you want to know what the number is of that one, you can quite easily get it from here. Like if you just need your burst DPS number and kind of how, if you are running, let's say, an apartment with perfect measured, like how much does that add on that specific build, you can come in here and just use that singular number. But it wouldn't make too much sense for comparing them, but we're going to compare them in the future. As I've already started, for instance, here we have the big updated version of the AR Striker with basically all of the talents. This is actually done and is in already the DPS tables. It is updated, as it says up there, TU22 updated. And it's already there and sorted. Well, this will be likely a future video, of course, as we'll go analyzing through them, but we'll analyze basically the perfect talents through this, because otherwise it wouldn't really make sense, because we need the stats of the weapon, of course, right? But you can definitely use the perfect talent calculator already as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed joining me for this video. I hope you found parts of it informative, and now hopefully you do know how to fill these in and kind of use them for yourself and kind of to analyze. One thing as well always is, especially if you do input a base separately, you can always play around with some of these numbers, and that is actually a way for yourself to kind of learn which talents kind of course, the stat that they're in, but how much does it get affected if we were to say instead of 150 we had 180 crit damage? How much would strains go down by, or such? Or if you're very low on crit chance, what happens to some of the stats and such. And of course, as well, headshots affecting crit damage as well. You can play around with having and not having crit chance, crit damage, as you can undo and redo and kind of read through yeah, which as I accidentally go to print, which talents get affected the most by headshots, basically. Because yeah, there's always as well, there's of course the headshots being additive to crit damage. All the talents that are crit damage based are going to be affected by that. But yeah, this took a while to update and was a hassle, but I'm happy to have done so and expanded it to be much bigger and have basically all of the talents, as that was a common request to have much more than the basics. And I feel this is the full list now. Although if you're kind of like, hey, there's still one missing or something, or would you like to add this to it, or have any ideas for this, feel free to, of course, yeah, put those in the comments down below. But yeah, let's conclude with saying that if you did enjoy this video and did find it enjoyable, if you can do any and all of the algorithm things down below, that's always appreciated. For my future videos, we're definitely going to go into a striker build showcase, although as well, with the AR list being complete now, I'm going to start working on the others as well, the SMG list and the rifle list next, and the LMG list, as these are the weapons on build with talents for those not familiar with this list, sorting, basically making a ranking, which can be very useful as a tool. Either of those might be the next video. We'll see how that kind of goes. Although, yeah, I do want to do a striker build showcase, as we haven't done one in a while. But yeah, I hope you join me for those. And as always, have a good night.